ahead and introduce our spotlight guest. Please welcome David Bohl. He is an independent addiction consultant with Beacon Confidential and author of Parallel Universes. He fully understands the challenges faced by so many who seek to escape from or drown their pain through external means. His story offers hope to those struggling with the reality of everyday life in today's increasingly stressful world. So welcome, David.
Thank you, Marcie. Glad to be here, and thank you, Pam and Jennifer and the Indiana Adoptee Network. I'm delighted and honored to be here, and I really appreciate the fact that you take the time in the beginning of the meeting to set some safety guidelines for us. And this came into play. I was in a call at lunch today with about 350 other participants on it, and one of the people in that meeting went unresponsive. And thankfully, somebody noticed it and called her boss in Buffalo, and they came and revived her, but it was the first time I had seen that before. So thanks for those comments about safety. You don't think you're going to need them, but sometimes we do, and hopefully not tonight. But as you mentioned, my name is David Bohl, and well, it is today anyway, and that's because I'm a person who was relinquished at birth and whose original birth certificate reads Baby Boy Bender. Baby Boy Bender. And yes, I do see the irony in being a person with the last name of Bender on his birth certificate talking to you about addiction and alcoholism. It's there have been some jokes made about it over the years, no doubt. But after that relinquishment, I was placed with a family about 7 days later, and I became David Bohl, or David Brian Bohl, middle initial B, and my adoption was legally completed about 14 months after that. I'm also a person who's in long-term recovery from alcohol addiction. What that means to me is that I haven't had to use alcohol to quiet my mind or for any other reason since August 22nd in 2005. And I'm in long-term recovery from nicotine addiction, which means I haven't had to use that speedball of illegal chemicals since June 19th, 2009. And I'm proud of these things. They're part of my identity, and they've shaped who I am today. And I'm proud to talk about overcoming those problems today. And I'll share a little bit about that with you. I reside in southeastern Wisconsin, and I typically work with individuals from all throughout the United States and sometimes across the border. I'm delighted that this is the second week in a row where the happy hour has been hosted by a male adoptee. So kudos to the Indiana Adoptee Network. It's great to hear those male voices, and I'm honored to be one of them. Last week's guest, Kevin D. Hoffman, who is the author of Growing Up Black in White, was outstanding, but he's a really tough act to follow. If you didn't see that, by all means, go to the Facebook page for the IAN and check out the replay. It's really worth the time. But again, thanks for letting me talk about adoption and addiction tonight. And I'm really honored that so many of you have taken time on a Friday night to be here with us. It's quite an honor. This is an immensely important topic. 10 years ago, I might have said it was a fringe topic, but those of us in the adoptee community know it's not fringe anymore. It's mainstream because we see it all the time. And lots of people are talking about it. I was at a virtual national adoptee conference last week where Zara Phillips was talking about this very thing. And I'm so delighted to see that that message is getting out and that people are being educated and being made aware of that link or the commonalities between adoption and addiction. And that's my hope in facilitating this discussion today. I just hope it stimulates thought and it heightens awareness of people in the room. I know a little bit about these things, both adoption and addiction. And I told you I was relinquished and adopted, but also in my profession, I've worked in the substance use disorder field for the past 11 or so years. And before opening my current private practice addiction consulting business, I was a director of addiction services for a large behavioral health hospital where we did both addiction and co-occurring disorders. And I got some great hospital experience doing that. And we oversaw a continuum of clinical services that helped these individuals. But also from my personal life, being a relinquishee and adoptee, I've also had other experiences. I've been a consumer of those substance use and mental health disorder treatment services. And I've been a consumer of recovery management and those mutual self-help support services. So what that really means is that I was able to cease the progression of my alcohol use disorder through an inpatient treatment stay after detoxing in a hospital. I've had to continue to work diligently on relapse prevention. As many of you know, addiction can be described as a lifelong dilemma that has to be worked on. And I continue to do that today. So I turn to others for that type of support, as well as doing work that I can do by myself. And included in that work now, although it wasn't in the beginning, is the fact that I was relinquished by my birth mother and adopted by another family as an infant. And ultimately what happened was this culminated in a long written inventory that I did that morphed into a memoir. And I continue to write about this at a blog and as a guest blogger in some other places. So We're going to talk about identity. So, in addition, I told you a bunch of things already. I'm a relinquishee, I'm an adoptee, I'm a person with alcohol use disorder, a person in recovery. I'm also a husband and a father and a brother and a half brother, an addiction recovery professional, but also I identify as some other things. May these ring true to you, but it's my hope to build some engagement here and to build a safe place for us to talk. So I'm going to disclose some things that some of you may or may not know about me. Number one, I'm an introvert. Being with people depletes my energy, whereas I know lots of extroverts who are energized by being with others. Not me. I'm a Myers-Briggs ISTJ. Some of you in this room I know are. That's the same thing, which means I tend to be reserved, yet I'm willful at times. I try to have a rational outlook on life. I take action really carefully, but I do it with purpose. I'm a ginger gener, and although you can't tell right now because the gray hair, I used to have carrot orange hair and red hair, and I still have the freckles. And I'm proud to be a ginger gener because there are only 2% of us in this world. I'm highly sensitive. That means that I experience responses to stimuli that are sometimes physical or mental or emotional, and I wear this about me. I used to wear it as a badge of disgrace as a male growing up in society, but I know that's part of me, and it is what it is. I describe myself also as an immersionist, and I don't mean the religious type who baptizes himself and others. I mean, I don't do things halfway. I jump into something, I immerse myself in life, and that's how I get through some things. And I'm a solitudinarian. I love solitude. It's how I recharge. As an adoptee, this may ring true to some others. I'm highly, some might say overly adaptable, which means is that I enter a situation and I survey the playing field, and I'm really hypervigilant about it. Paul Sunderland, who's a therapist that has dealt with adoptees for many years, talks about this in his lectures. He says, an adoptee walks into the room and they say, what does someone have to do to get around here? It's the first thing on our minds. What do I have to do to kind of be invisible and fit in, right? So overly adaptable, right, is something I describe myself as. And as well as being a chronic malcontent. I am continually uncomfortable about something. It's just who I am. It's my disposition. It probably triggered some addiction behaviors in the past, but I know this about myself, and I now have some healthy outlets to go forward with it. And I would call myself a conscientious persister, which means that sometimes I just have to knuckle down, right? As adoptees, we know this. Sometimes we know what's ahead of us. We know it's going to be a lot of work. We know there's going to be an emotional drain, but sometimes we have to do it. So we have to persist through these things. And I take pride in that because I wasn't always that way. I would do other things instead. So my mother, my adopted mother at one time called me complicated. And I don't like that at all. I like to say complex because complicated assumes overly so, but I like to say I'm complex. And I know that a lot of adoptees are, and a lot of people exposed to addiction or substance use disorders or behavioral disorders are also very complex. So anyway, that's how I identify. And I hope you were thinking as we were going through this about how you identify, because it's important to know when we talk about these heavy subjects of identity, what that means to us. And what I'd like to do is I'd like to ask some questions about who's in the room. Now, these are going to be anonymous questions. We'll see the answers, but we won't know who answered what, and it's all voluntary. So if you're not comfortable answering these questions, please, by all means, take a pass. I'm really sensitive to language, and I know a lot of you are. So these lists are not 100% comprehensive, and they weren't meant to provoke anyone or trigger anyone about language. They're trying to do the opposite. So if you could please take a look beyond that, that would be great. So let's talk about the poll. First question is going to ask about your adoption experience in a couple of ways. I hope all of you see polling on your screen. Can someone wave to me if they do? Great. The first question talks about adoption. Do you identify as any of the following? Are you an adoptee or a relinquishee, or first or birth or biological mother or father, an adoptive mother or father? Are you an extended family member? Are you perhaps an adoption professional? Are you an adoption advocate of some sort or an interesting party? Polling will appear on your screen. Please go right ahead if you're comfortable. Again, this is completely voluntary. This will remain anonymous, and hopefully we will get some information that we can talk about going forward. I see some people starting to answer. Thank you. We'll give somebody some time. Is anyone having problems seeing the poll? It doesn't look like question number 1 is getting answered as frequently as others. Oh, by the way, I didn't mention you can also choose more than one answer to the poll. You may be more than one of these things, of course, and they're part of your identity. By all means, don't be afraid to share with us what that's all about. As you're contemplating that first question, that first poll question that again should have popped up on your screen, I'll talk about the second question. And the second question is very straightforward. It asks, do you identify as having experienced any of the following? Have you experienced trauma or separation or abandonment or perhaps loss and grief or powerlessness and anger or anxiety? And if you had trust or attachment concerns, have you experienced guilt or shame or secrecy? Have you had identity issues or some types of developmental interruptions? Are these some things that you relate to? And I'm talking about this so people can have a chance to vote. It looks like people are getting much more active on the second question than perhaps they were the first one. So thank you very much for that. As all of you respond, I'll go right into the next question. It asks, as I can scroll on my screen, regarding addiction or substance use disorder or behavioral addiction disorders, do you identify as any of the following? Are you a professional within the treatment industry or the recovery management field? Are you perhaps an addiction physician or a psychiatrist or a therapist or a counselor or a social worker or an interventionist, or are you a peer recovery specialist or community organizer? If you could let us know, that would be very helpful. Again, that's question number 3. You should be able to just scroll down to that on your screen if you'd like to choose to answer. And thank you so far again for those of you who have responded. We're getting at least half of the people voting, and I appreciate that you're doing that. Thank you. I can see the results on my screen. I'm not going to spoil it for anyone. We will share these results when we're done, but I don't think we're going to be surprised by a lot of them. Again, that was question number 3. And the final question is, well, there are 2 final questions. Number 1, have you, and it's number 4 in your poll, have you been affected by someone with an addiction, with a substance use disorder and a behavioral disorder? Have you been affected by someone, yourself, someone else? Number 5, have you been affected by someone with mental health issues? Have you been affected by someone with mental health issues? So the polling's been going on for a short period of time. We'll give it just a few more moments as we contemplate what is going on here. Again, I invite everyone to consider these and other parts of their identity, because it is so important for us to talk about identity when we're talking about relinquishment. So lots of votes, really appreciate it so far. Let's give it another 10 seconds and then we will end the polling and we'll see what we found out. Again, thank you in advance for having done that. About 2 minutes, 2 seconds, 3. All right, thank you so much. So we have some interesting results to share. Here we go, let's take a look. So the first question, not surprisingly, 79% of the people in this room have identified as adoptees. That shouldn't come as a surprise at an event sponsored and facilitated by the Indiana Adoptee Network. So great job. We're getting the people in this room that we hope to. And then you can see how other people identify. We have some first or biological mothers, we have adoptive parents, we have extended family members, we have social workers and addiction or adoption advocates, and we have some other professionals in this room. Question number 2, not surprisingly, these items were answered very affirmatively. It seems like many people in this room have experienced many of those very things that are typical, not only in life, but probably more so in the relinquishee universe. And we'll talk about that in greater detail later on. But imagine that trauma, all of these things have been experienced by a vast majority of the people who responded to this question. Regarding substance use disorder and behavioral disorder, have people experienced it? And either people chose not to answer or they didn't fit in one of those categories. So they were either professionals or they were not. So we have a few professionals in the room, which is outstanding. Welcome. And we have non-professionals. I'm glad, because that's exactly what this discussion is designed for. Question number 4, have you been affected by someone with an addiction or substance use disorder? 82% of us said that we had, and that is not unusual in this day and age. It has definitely been prevalent, become even more prevalent in our time. And certainly if you're watching the news and you're hearing about anything other than politics and COVID, you're certainly hearing about overdose and the substance use disorder and drug problem we have in our world. So that's not surprising. And have you been affected by someone with mental health issues? And 88% of the people who responded had reported that they were. Again, thank you for sharing your answers to that poll. What I hope it does is it makes people aware of the issues that we're facing, and it kind of sets a stage for talking about what we need to talk about. And again, look at all the identities that are represented here tonight. Right there are a whole bunch, and a whole bunch of them are tied together. And again, the reason we did this is I think it's important, especially when we're talking about persons affected by adoption and relinquishees to start and to be supportive and to make safe a discussion about identity, because relinquishment and adoption can create those many issues around identity. And to let the cat out of the bag, in terms of the way I look at things, I think the general way that we heal is by expanding our identities in an informed, gentle way. That is by context and by perspective. Oh, I'm going to try to. There we go. Wanted to close the poll. So what we'll talk about now is a discussion about that link between adoption and addiction. And the thing that is really the most prevalent in the discussion is the short answer to the ultimate question that many of you have come here for: are adoption and addiction tied together somewhere? And of course, the answer is yes. Trauma and addiction are indisputably linked. And I'll give you an abridged version of what all kinds of research around this topic is shown. It's shown it in the addiction field, it's shown it in the adoption field, it's shown it in the mental health field, but it's really quite simple. And here's the synopsis of all that research. The more troubled your childhood, the higher your risk for later health problems in life. The more troubled your childhood, the higher your risk for later problems in life. And sometimes people who have been relinquished or adopted to have that type of trouble early in their life. And of course, in this forum, that might sound really straightforwardly intuitive and obvious, but lots of people have been talking about it for a long time. That's why we know about it. For example, Dr. Nadine Burke-Harris, the pediatrician and Surgeon General of California, she's talked about childhood experiences and their harmful effects later in life for years. Dr. Gabor Mate is a Canadian physician who worked in the downtrodden areas of Vancouver with the homeless population of drug addicts. And he's been communicating this for years, but it always hasn't been directly understood or acknowledged. And you heard me reference him earlier, but Paul Sunderland, who's a therapist in England, who one day, I shouldn't say one day, but noticed after some study of his experiences that a great percentage of his clients were presenting with having been relinquished and adopted. He's done two great lectures. One was a 2011 LifeWorks lecture called Adoption and Addiction, Remembered Not Recalled. And more recently, he did another YouTube lecture at ICAD in 2019 titled Relinquishment and Adoption, Understanding the Impact of Early Psychological Wounds. And despite the fact that these people have been doing this work for years and decades sometimes, it's not mainstream. There are some pockets of discussion in our community, but not everybody understands this. And there's always been the age-old question, what came first? What came first, the addiction? Did that come first, or did the trauma come first? And we have to ask those questions, but the research again says the more troubled your childhood, the higher your risk in later life problems, including addiction. And most of that research originated from what many of you may have known as the Adverse Childhood Experiences Study. It was a study conducted 20 plus years ago from 1995 to 1997 by the Centers for Disease Control and Kaiser Permanente. They had a research base of 17,000 individuals, and it became, and still is to this day, one of the largest investigations of childhood abuse and neglect and later life health and well-being that's ever been conducted. And that ACE score, that Adverse Childhood Experience score, is used to assess cumulative childhood stress. And childhood stress leads to increased risk of later health problems, both physical and mental. And I know some folks in this room are familiar with the Adverse Childhood Experiences studies. I know some are not. That's why we're going to talk about them a little bit, but not for too long, because they can be it can be overwhelming at times. But basically what the survey was initially was a 10-question survey. And what it determined was that early psychological wounds came from emotional experiences, they came from neglect, and they came from household dysfunction. Again, emotional experiences, neglect, and household dysfunction as children. And there were 10 questions initially that asked people before your 18th birthday, and I will give a warning here, they are intrusive questions. No one's going to be asked to answer them here. They can be triggering for some, but we hope not. We hope we're going to have a positive discussion about this as a result of knowing what these questions are. But question number one, prior to your 18th birthday, did a parent or any other adult in your household swear at you, insult you, put you down, or humiliate you, or act in a way that made you feel physically hurt? Question two, did a parent or other adult in the household push, grab, slap, or throw something at you? Did an adult person at least 5 years older than you ever do something sexually offensive, touch or fondle you in an inappropriate way? Four, did you ever or very often feel that no one in your family loved you or thought you were important or special, or that your family didn't look out for each other, feel close to each other, support each other? Five, did you often or very often feel like you didn't have enough to eat, had to wear dirty clothes, had no one to protect you, or your parents were too drunk or high to take care of you or to take you to a doctor if needed. 6, were your parents ever separated or divorced? 7, was your parent or step parent often or very often pushed, grabbed, slapped, or had something thrown at them? 8, did you live with someone who was a problem drinker or alcoholic or who used street drugs? 9, was a household member depressed or mentally ill, or did a household member attempt suicide? And 10, did a household member go to prison? So this formed the basis of the 17,000 individuals. They polled them and they determined some results from having done that. And by the way, did anyone see relinquishment or adoption specifically mentioned in that list? I didn't. Now, not using those words, maybe in number 4, where it asked if you ever felt that no one in your family loved you, or you thought you weren't important or special, or your family didn't look out for each other, or you didn't feel close to each other or support each other, but there was no specific mention of relinquishment or adoption in that adverse childhood experiences questionnaire. So the important thing about that is to remember it's meant to be a guideline. That list was not inclusive. Sadly, we're human beings and we find new ways to harm each other all the time. So there are many other adverse childhood experiences, including relinquishment and adoption experiences. And I don't think it's a stretch to reason that if you experience separation from your birth mother, and or there are types of some toxic stress over months or years, like adoption and difficulty attaching or attuning to caregivers, or people who should be trusted, then you would likely increase your risk of health consequences over a lifetime. And additionally, adverse childhood experiences are quite common. They were found to be quite common in that study. We know them to be quite common today, which breaks my heart to say that. Almost 2/3 of those study participants reported at least one adverse childhood experience of that list. And more than 1 in 5, 20% reported 3 or more ACEs. Now, I don't have the exact demographics in front of me of that study. I've read them before, but this was not a hugely disadvantaged population that they surveyed. This was a population that had resources and supports in their lives. So this was astonishingly scary to those of us when it came out. Of course, it didn't get legs until 10 or more years after the study. So it took a little while to figure out what this meant. And of course, what it meant was that there's a graded dose response relationship between the adverse childhood experiences and negative health and your well-being across the lifespan. And what that graded dose response means is that the more stressors there are, the more the questions you answered yes, the greater the risk for health problems. And through that study, 20 some years ago, they identified specifically some things that people were struggling with. And they had risk of the following. Listen to this list, it's very scary. Alcoholism and alcohol abuse, chronic pulmonary disease, depression, fetal death, health-related quality of life, illicit drug use, heart disease, liver disease, poor work performance, multiple sexual partners, sexually transmitted diseases, smoking, suicide attempts, unintended pregnancies, early initiation of smoking, early initiation of sexual activity, adolescent pregnancy, risk for sexual violence, poor academic achievement, and the list goes on. It's exhausted. So all of these things, as that graded dose response, as the number of stressors and the number of adverse childhood experiences increased, the greater the risk was to people's health over their lifetime, not just short-term, over their lifetime. So that's a little background. So we asked the question, right? Is adoption an adverse childhood experience? And the answer to me is absolutely yes. I guess the more complete question is relinquishment and adoption a trauma? And the answer to that is yes, sometimes. Relinquishment and abandonment can be experienced as a PTSD type trauma, and adoption, right, moving into a family that just genetically doesn't mirror someone, can be experienced as a developmental or a chronic trauma or stress. And this is corroborated in other studies, and other studies related to this support this. And what I'm doing is I'm looking up at my screen. I'm going to again drop into the chat box a list of a web link that points to the citations and links that I'm referring to during this talk. And now you don't have to go on and pull them now, but if you want to copy that for later and take a look at some of these things, these studies are substantiated by peer-reviewed research. So 50 to 66% of people who suffer from PTSD also have addiction, 1/2 to 2/3. People who suffer from trauma are 2 to 4 times more likely to battle addiction than people who don't have it. Co-occurring PTSD and addiction. If you have both PTSD and addiction, you're going to have a more complex and costly clinical course. It's going to be tougher to eradicate it than with someone who doesn't have it, or for either of those disorders alone. And you're going to be predisposed to increased health problems, poor social functioning, higher rates of suicide attempts, more legal problems, increased risk of violence, a worse treatment adherence, and less improvement during treatment than people who don't have both that trauma and the addiction. And on the flip side, who succeeds? Well, better rates of abstinence from substances and lower rates of mental health symptoms are obtained. So people are treated more efficiently when both the trauma and the addiction are treated concurrently and in an integrated way. So at the same time, by a team that understands what the others in the team are doing, and they're doing that in a trauma-informed and an adoption-competent way, or a trauma-competent way. So you say, and you're smart, and I see some skepticism out there, you say, just because addiction and trauma are linked, doesn't necessarily mean that one causes the other, right? Well, right. The disease model of addiction says that addiction is a primary disease, that it's not caused by something else. And like many other mental health disorders, several factors may contribute to the development of addiction. In other words, they may predispose one to addiction. And those main factors, of course, are genetics, because your family had a history of this and they have to hand it to you, and environment. What did it look like growing up? Were there psychological wounds? Were there problems with neglect and your environment that caused you to process things differently? Again, these factors are about predisposition, not cause. So genetics and environment make people more inclined to experience addiction, but they don't guarantee that a person is going to experience addiction. So we have to be really careful with that. We're still working on what causes addiction. We don't know. We don't know. We have all kinds of explanations for it. We have great ways to treat it. But we don't know ultimately what causes that primary disease. So we have to ask the question, did my trauma, did the trauma of being relinquished as a newborn cause my addiction to alcohol? No, it didn't cause it. It predisposed me to have an unhealthy relationship with alcohol. And again, did the struggles I had attaching and trusting my adopted family and resultingly many other relationships I had cause my addiction to alcohol? No, but I certainly believe it predisposed me to alcohol. And what I know for sure is this, and maybe this will resonate with you. Again, I'm going to disclose some things in an effort to engage you, number one, but also to validate some experience in case you're having them, because these are not things that are unique to me. These are things I've heard over and over and over throughout the years from adoptees, people, families who have adopted people, clinicians, doctors, etc. Growing up, I always felt like I was different, not in a good way, and that I didn't belong, and that I lacked that instruction manual that's everybody else seemed to have. And I struggled with identity, right? No surprise, I'm talking about identity. I struggled with it, and I didn't know who I was because I didn't have any biological markers to draw from. I didn't have any mirroring in my family, but also because I was living in fear all the time and shame. I was always protecting myself from that hurt and that shame and being seen for something that was wrong with me. And I literally suffered from an identity crisis. It's a term we don't use very often, but it's very appropriate in the circles in which we travel. An identity crisis is that period of uncertainty or confusion where a person's sense of identity becomes insecure. And that term was coined by the German developmental psychiatrist Erik Erikson years ago. He studied and created a model of the stages of a developing individual should go through in order to develop resilience to meet life's challenges. And not coincidentally, to our purposes tonight, Erikson was an adoptee. And if you want to learn more about adoptees and get some great stories, this book, Finding Our Place, 100 Memorable Adoptees, Foster Persons, and Orphanages Alumni by Nikki McCaslin, Richard Erlob, and Marilyn Grotsky is outstanding. So in addition to Erikson, who's in this book, 99 other individuals who were relinquished are in that book as well. So having said that, it's not a stretch to apply Erikson's developmental work and say simply that adoptive children have more difficult and less culturally supported developmental tasks to achieve than those in functioning biologically related family. They have more difficult tasks and they have less culturally supported developmental tasks than people in biologically functioning families. And for me, Erikson was right on. I know I experienced these identity struggles because I failed to achieve that healthy ego, that healthy self-identity during my adolescence. And I struggled with relational issues like attachment, and I had no idea who to trust or how to trust, including myself. And I suffered. Right? I suffered and I agonized. I always felt alone. I felt isolated. I felt misunderstood. And at the time, I didn't even have the vocabulary to describe these things, let alone trust anyone enough to talk with them about it. And that was in part was due to shame, but it was more than shame. And we call it that trifecta of self-conscious emotions that was in play: that abandonment, that betrayal, and the shame. Abandonment, betrayal, and shame, which leaves a deep scar on many of us who have relinquished and who have suffered other traumas. But then something happened, right? Oh, things were going horribly. I felt truly alone, and then something amazing happened, and that was the fact that I accidentally stumbled upon alcohol, and alcohol became a solution to all these problems that I couldn't even quantify or describe. Most people, and maybe some in this room would say that when they were young, alcohol and other chemicals acted as a social lubricant. It helped them with that social discomfort they had in their teen years. And I would say, yeah, that was partially true for me, but it was more than that. For me, I felt like with that first drink that I'd found a connection, and the people that I was drinking with had found a deeper level of connection with me than anywhere else I had ever gone or anywhere else I could go. Additionally, professionals say that people who experience addiction cease in their psychosocial or their personal development the moment they begin using drugs or alcohol in addictive ways. So for me, looking back on that time when I first took that drink at age 13, I can now say that I was probably drinking alcoholically immediately, because alcohol simply altered my perceptions. It made me believe things or see things in my world that weren't based in fact. It changed my reality. So I believe I used alcohol as a coping mechanism, and it further contributed to that identity crisis where it stood in the way of me in my healthy development. I numbed and medicated instead of processing life, and that was not a good thing to do. And it was not a good thing to do for any number of years. And eventually that progressive nature of alcohol addiction that many of you have heard about turned on me and caught up with me. And what was once that magic elixir, that medicine for what ailed me, became a poison. It went from being a solution to problems to becoming the problem, the overwhelming problem. Not overnight, of course, there's a progression. That's what happens sometimes with substance use disorder, but it happened and it was ugly in the end. I will say, without giving details, physically, emotionally, psychologically, and relationally, it was not a good place to be. But thankfully, I had an awakening and I was able to get sober and clear my mind. I did that with help, with the medical help that I mentioned earlier, with the treatment help I mentioned. And once the dust settled, everything was not well. I continued to feel lost. I felt that something was wrong with me beyond my addiction. And who wouldn't, right? Something that I hadn't processed for years all of a sudden was screaming me in the face, right? Something had to be wrong with me. I was given up as an infant. What was wrong with me, right? And that's the way I felt. So I had to continue to dig deeper into the work and figure it out. I had to be that conscientious persister that I talked about early in the call. And some might say, to use some 12-step recovery concept, that I had to take a searching and fearless inventory of what was going on in my life, which meant to me that I had to start questioning my perceptions. I had to look at what I thought was reality and see, hey, is that really what's going on? And I had to pick up that process of personal development, including learning some healthy coping mechanisms for life's challenges from where I left off, from where they were developmentally interrupted by me interrupting them with alcohol use to numb feelings. But I know then, and I know now, that if I don't do this work, first my addiction and then the second shame, were literally going to tear me apart. And I chose those words very carefully, tear, because I often felt that I was at war with myself, that my identities, my selves, my fragmented selves were being ripped further and further away from each other. So I had to do this work. I had to do this work to better understand myself and to get healthy. But I had to discover and solidify my identity and answer that question once and for all, at least in the moment. Who am I? Who am I? And I've learned the hard way that I need to do that all the time. I need to continually do that, right? I have to ask that question to stay happy and healthy in all of those ways that we mentioned before. But more specifically, this journey that I have been on and the trek that I expect to be on for the rest of my life is about basically investigating how my experiences, that is the context of my life and my observations, my perceptions, have combined to define who I am today, and explaining that role of myself, examining who I am, right? My identity, character, values, personality, psyche, my spirit, in the past, present, and the future. And that to me is what healing is all about. That to me is what a recovering individual in David is all about. It's all about identity development, and it's about identity expansion. So having said that, we get back to the question, is relinquishment and adoption a type of trauma? Yes. Not only do I believe so, but others do as well. Is it an adverse childhood experience? I believe so, as do others. More data for you. And I'm going to put in the chat room a link to the citations that support this research. This is about adoption. Many of you know this, but let's go through it anyway. 7 million Americans are adopted, which is about 2% of the population. 1.5 US children are adopted, which is about 2% of the population. About 100 million Americans have adoption in their families, 30% of the population. 70% or more likely more of adoptions today are open. That is, information is disclosed between the parties affected by it, compared to my closed adoption in 1960, where nothing was shared. And that's because the benefits of open adoption for all parties is very well established in the research now, from all aspects, not just for the adoptee, but for relinquishing mothers, adoptive families, all involved, as long as they go okay. Adopted adults have higher degrees of mental health issues. Adopted adults and adolescents are more likely to receive counseling. Adopted persons have increased risk of substance use disorder, addictions in their lifetimes, 50% higher, or 1.5 times the general population. Not only are adoptees more likely to have difficulties with drug and alcohol use, but also eating disorders, attention deficit disorder, suicide, and the one that strikes me every time I remember it is untimely pregnancies. Adoptees have been found to manifest a higher rate of personality disorders, antisocial personality, borderline personality disorder. And here is going to be the understatement of the entire night, right? This will make so much sense, but it needs to be said. Although adopted persons can often lead similar lives to non-adopted people, I think I'm leading a similar life to non-adopted people, they can experience circumstances that need to be overcome, right? Loss, grief, identity development, self-esteem, lack of information about medical background, including addiction and mental health predispositions. Adopted persons have to overcome these circumstances, and sometimes we need help to do this. So again, right, does this mean that relinquishment and adoption trauma predispose one to addiction? The answer is they can. It's part of that environmental component that predisposes one to addiction. Doesn't guarantee it. Not everyone's experience is the same, but it predisposes one. And again, we know more, right? We know that as a group, we know this, and I know this personally from my experiences, not thinking about relinquishment or not talking about it in adoption and not looking at those causes and conditions, right? Putting that box on the shelf and never wanting to take it down, continue to feed the shame, right? I imagine the worst instead of finding out what was really going on. And again, I referred to Dr. Gabor Mate. Now this is the third time, a Canadian physician. He wrote a book titled In the Realm of Hungry Ghosts. It's an incredible read of experiences and has lots of applications for the relinquished crowd. He said something very pointedly and something very appropriate for us. And I talked tonight, quote, he said, quote, as we delve into the specific research, we need to avoid the trap of believing that addiction can be reduced to the actions of brain chemicals or nerve circuits or any other kind of neurobiological, psychological, or sociological data. A multi-level exploration is necessary because it's impossible to understand addiction fully from any one perspective, right? As we go to that complexity, it's all complex again, no matter how accurate. Addiction is a complex condition, a complex interaction between human beings and their environment. We need to view it simultaneously from many different angles, or at least while we're examining it from one angle, we need to keep the others in mind, because addiction has biological, chemical, neurological, psychological, medical, emotional, social, political, economic, and spiritual underpinnings. And by the way, I'm interjecting, as does adoption, and perhaps others I haven't thought about. To get anywhere near a complete picture, we must keep shaking the kaleidoscope to see what patterns emerge. Wow, kaleidoscope, what a description. And it's a description that works for adoptees as well. Yes, addiction stories are very complex. Adoption stories are very complex. For me, it means any number of things, right? We can describe addiction and adoption in a number of ways, but again, I have to shake the kaleidoscope. So to say that addiction is a primary disease, and that's the only thing that matters, well, it's important and it's correct to say that it's a primary disease, but it's not complete. Right? To say that I have this disease that has genetic and environmental etiology, that has biopsychosocial spiritual symptoms, is true, but it's only a partial explanation or diagnosis. To say that I have this chronic brain disease that produces dysregulation in dopamine is right on, but it doesn't describe the whole scenario. It's not complete. To say that my addiction is characterized by all the criteria that are used to diagnose it, to say that I have an ability to consistently abstain, that I have impairment in my behavioral control, that I have cravings, that I have diminished recognition of significant problems, that I have interpersonal relationship problems, and that I produce a dysfunctional emotional response. Well, right on. No truer words have been spoken, but they're not complete. Likewise, to say that I had a trauma as a result of being relinquished is only a partial explanation of what my experience is and who I am today. And to say that I had adoption, attachment, and identity issues as a result of this chronic developmental or this relational trauma is true, yet it's only a fragment of that kaleidoscope that Dr. Mate has described. Again, all of these things are accurate, but I need to consider them together to gain a more comprehensive picture of my very complex identity. And I get this. I'm an adoptee. This is not easy. This is hard work sometimes. This requires at times an outside perspective, an unbiased perspective from someone who will hold me supportive, to be supportive, but also hold me accountable and make me feel safe. Right? This takes work. So when we have both of these things, it takes even more work. But I have to do that work. What does that life look like today? What does my life look like today? What does recovery look like today? Well, as I said, it's about continuing to do the work. It's about persisting and building resilience even more. We need to do that as a people. We need to work on that oftentimes as adoptees and relinquishees as well. I have to continue to build and live a healthy philosophy in life. And I say philosophy, some might say spirituality, some may say religion. Others may look at it differently. That's what it's about for me. It's about relationality, right? I have to stay connected to people and communities who allow me to feel safe and validate my experiences. And we're looking at some of these examples right now, right? The Indiana Adoptee Network is one of those communities. I've attended and even spoken at a male adoptee and alumni impact summit, which unfortunately was postponed this year due to COVID, but it's an incredible community of support, male support. There's a group called Adoptees in Recovery, which is part of Adoptees Connect. You can find it out on Facebook. You might have seen, if you're in the chat room early in the group, there's a group called Adoptees in Addiction, which is a private Facebook group, but they have a Saturday afternoon meeting for people who have been relinquished, who are seeking or are in recovery. And there's a virtual support group that I attend here in Wisconsin called Adult Adoptees, and it's put on by the Wisconsin Adoption and Permanency organization. So I have to stay close to those communities, not just to feel safe, but so that they hold me accountable. They call me on my stuff, right? They see perspective that I might not be able to see. So for me, I use 3 words. I call this relentlessly pursuing reality, right? I have to constantly check context and perspectives in my life because my early experiences were adverse to me, and they formed my thinking and my perceptions and colored my perceptions in a way that isn't always healthy or useful to me later on in life, right? So I just have to keep shaking that kaleidoscope. And I know, again, as a relinquishee and an adoptee, that this can sometimes be terrifying. Yet I have to do it to remain healthy and to build further resilience. And sometimes I have to reach out for help to do it. So I continue to do it. I do, because I know what it was like before when I didn't do it. It was hell. I mean, if there was a hell on earth, I was living it for any number of reasons. But today, my life is absolutely phenomenal. I don't say that to be arrogant. I don't say that to be boastful. My mantra has been, since I've done this work, in most ways, my life is ideal. And I believe that to be true, even in this COVID world. In most ways, more than not, my life is good. I have great relationships with family and friends. I'm married to a woman who's put up with me for 36 years. We have a great relationship. I have 2 adult children who are actively in my life. As an example of relating to biological relatives, both of my biological parents had passed before I went looking for them, but I've had the good fortune of meeting a sister of my father and a half brother and a half sisters, and I'm building relationships with them and their families. And I certainly couldn't have done that without having done this work and having gotten a perspective that allowed me to do that. And, I truly enjoy the work that I do with the people and the people I get to work with. I don't really enjoy talking in public, although I've done it all my life, but I enjoy sharing my story because I know people relate to it, and hopefully it launches some people in an investigation, and it gives them the feeling of support and safety that they might need to pursue their own investigation and get their own questions answered. And I guess most importantly, something that I didn't have before that alcohol and nicotine and other behaviors did for me is I'm at peace with myself, right? I know who I am, I know myself, and I'm at peace with myself. Although I'm not always at peace with the world, that I'm working on, but I'm at peace with myself. I accept it and I coexist with reality. And I'm grateful for all of that. I now have an expansive identity that I'm proud of, and that serves me very healthily today. That was really long-winded. I did a lot of talking and we covered a lot of ground. I hope this provided to all or some of you an opportunity to connect maybe some previously unconnected ideas or experiences. I thank you for your attention this evening. I'll turn it back to Marcie. I believe we might have some time for some questions.
Great. Thank you so much, David. We really appreciate your presentation this evening. And yes, we would like to go ahead and open it up to all of you to have your opportunity to ask questions. I don't see anything in the chat bar yet, but you can go ahead and raise your virtual hand or take yourself off of mute and go ahead and ask the first question.